Well, my name is Kermit Brown. And I've got all my plaques here on the wall so I can look and check my dates. But I was Speaker of the House in 2015 and 2016. And just by way of perspective, I was president of the Wyoming State Bar in 1994 and 1995. So that preceded my time in the legislature, which I think was really valuable. And then now, as some of you may know, after I left the legislature, why I became a trustee of the university. So that's what I'm doing today. I spent a total of 12 years in the legislature, which means if you count the days up, I spent exactly 1 year of my life on the floor of the House, and through 6 terms. And I was fortunate that I never had a scare about being reelected at home. And one of the really interesting things about becoming, well, first majority floor leader and then speaker, is that you're running an election within an election. So you're running at home to get reelected and be sent back to the legislature, and then you're running an election or a campaign within the legislature to be elected to that position, whatever it may be.
Will you talk a little bit about a citizen legislature and what you think are some of the advantages of that? And then if you think there are any disadvantages as well.
A citizen legislature is my preference. However, a lot of the problems that the legislature deals with, make no mistake, they're very complicated, very involved, and very difficult to understand. Of course, I have the advantage, I'm a lawyer, and I'd practiced law for 40 years before I went in the legislature. And I know these green books here inside and out before I got there. It's really difficult for citizens. So it takes 2 years at a minimum for a person to come into the legislature and get to the point where they can begin to understand the process. It probably takes 4 years for a citizen legislator who's applying themselves to get to the point where they can really be effective, and where they can take an idea or a constituent concern and get it into law. So that's maybe one of the disadvantages, because I think a lot of, for instance, Colorado, an awful lot of their legislators are lawyers, and that you can consider that an advantage or disadvantage, either way you want to. But I think they probably have a better grasp of some of the problems. Do they get to a better solution? I'm not sure they do, but they have a better grasp. So that's, the beauty of a citizen legislator is that you really have grassroots people, and they're getting involved in government, and they're cycling through all the time. What you do lose sometimes, and I know this is sort of goes to term limits, something that there's a lot of controversy about, is term limits and whether they ought to be in effect or not. And especially with the citizen legislature, it all kind of goes together. I will tell you this: there are always the bad examples about term limits are what you hear in the news. You never hear about the good stuff. And I will tell you, without a doubt, there are some legislators in Congress. There are some people in Congress that have been there for 40 years that know those rules. You just can't believe the intricacy of the rules and the maze that you have to go through to get something done. And there are people that have been there for 30 or 40 years that understand those, and they are doing amazing things. And term limits would knock them out. And so you never hear about them. You never hear about all the good work they're doing, the things that they're able to do. All you hear about is the bad actors. And, well, we need to have term limits and knock them all out. Now, here's the thing about citizen legislators and about term limits. If you have term limits, or if you have too many citizen legislators there that haven't been there before, then the balance of power shifts from the legislature to the executive branch. It shifts to the agency heads, not the governor. The governor may be a rookie, him or herself, but it shifts to the agency heads because they've been there for a long time. They know where all the nooks and crannies are, all the little hooks and the things that are going on. And there's no way that a fresh citizen legislator, even at the 4-year level, knows where all those things are. And so the legislature has no power because it has no knowledge, and all the knowledge shifts to the executive branch. Now, here's the other thing that goes on. Legislators typically, when they begin in the legislature, are assigned to some committee or another. And those agency heads are just pros at winning those legislators over. So the rookie legislator, the first term, the second term, really become, and I even found that for myself, and I knew it was coming. I knew some things that, because my wife was in the legislature for one thing, and I'd watched this for a long time. But the new legislators tend to become advocates for the agency because the agency heads win them over, and that's the only thing they're hearing. It's just like on a bank board. You know, you go on a bank board, well, the president of the bank shows you where the bathroom is and shows you where your book is and everything. Well, sure, you know, you're drinking the Kool-Aid, and so you're an advocate for the president. How long do you have to be on a bank board before you can finally begin to take a more skeptical look at the president of the bank? And it's the same way in the legislature. And it takes probably that 4-year period of time before a legislator can get it into perspective and can really look at this agency head and say, is this individual doing a good job? Are they not doing a good job? Where's their weaknesses? Where are their strengths? And what's going on? So I love citizen legislators, but it does require, I think it's incumbent on the people of the state of Wyoming to send legislators down to Cheyenne that have a passion and an interest for it and are ready to really apply themselves. Because that first 4 years, especially the first 2, it's just baffling.
Can you maybe, I think we hear that a lot from legislators who say, you know, I look back on my freshman year and, you know, smile to think at what I didn't know, or, you know, just kind of the steps I took. Can you talk a little bit about that, the learning curve or the increase of capacity as you move from a freshman and then up into Speaker of the House, you know, taking on more responsibility? What are some of the tips and tricks or tools or knowledge base, as you say, that you're kind of acquiring in that process?
One critical area is the rules. And it's sort of a hand in glove deal. You can't understand the rules until you sort of understand the process. You can't understand the process till you understand the rules. So, excuse me, you just kind of flounder around back and forth between the two of them. But the rules are so important. And I don't necessarily mean the technical rules about like when can you speak and when can you do something like that. But what are the rules about how a legislation's introduced and how it's the processes it goes through? Committee of the whole, what's committee of the whole, what's second reading, different rules, third reading, different rules, what's going on. Then it leaves one body, goes to the other. So then you're getting stuff from the other body that's already passed them. Then it's got to go through the same process. And then if the two bodies disagree, then you get into a whole nother rat's nest of rules about conference committees and who's going to serve on the conference committee and how are the differences between the two bodies going to be resolved. Understanding that if they don't resolve them, then you've got a bill that passed both bodies in a different form, and it never becomes a bill because they can't be reconciled. Now, I remember one time when I was a freshman legislator, Jim Hegeman, who was Harriet Hegeman's dad, was a legislator from Lingle, I think Lingle, and he was a chairman of a conference committee. So I got appointed to this conference committee. He was the chairman of the conference committee for the House. Somebody else, I think Hank Coe might have been the chairman in the Senate. I think it was Hank because it was really odd to do it. And Jim Hegeman didn't like this bill. He didn't like where it was going. So he said, just go over and tell him we're not going to meet. Well, okay. So I went over and told him we weren't going to meet. And if you don't meet, you don't agree. And so by doing that, Hegeman just effectively killed the bill right there. And so there are all those little nuances. And I don't know how long it takes to learn them. And so all you can do is go in the legislature and begin to get in the flow. And the bills are flowing through, and hopefully a freshman legislator once in a while can sit back for a minute on a particular bill and say, now, let me see what's really going on here. Where are we in this long convoluted process. Where are we in this and what's going on? And it just takes a long time to learn.
That's awesome. That's a great story. Will you talk a little bit about the difference between a budget session and a general session and kind of how they flow differently, or what it looks and feels like from the floor too?
A regular session is 40 days, and there might be what's called a supplementary budget bill in the regular session. I think we're going to see fewer and fewer of those. The governor's been raising Cain about them. Some of the leadership's been raising Cain and saying, look, a biennial budget's a biennial budget, and you shouldn't be going in the off years and fine tuning that thing. You should have thought of it before. And the governor came out and told me, he said, unless it's a true emergency, a truly unforeseen event, we're not going to have these supplementary budget sessions. We used to have them when we had lots of money because we couldn't get it all spent in the regular budget session. There was always more money cropping up. So we would just have a heyday. But I think you're going to see that come to a stop. So you're going to have the regular session, the 40-day session, and it's going to be all about substantive law and all about whatever crisis the legislature is faced with. That's a 40-day session. And, you know, back in antiquity, I can remember this. We used to meet 40 days every other year. That's all we did, remember. And then we put in the budget session because I think the legislators felt that the budget wasn't getting sufficient attention when you only met 40 days every other year. So we said, okay, we'll put in an interim meeting of the legislature for 20 days. And remember, we're talking about expense here. My number, which I think is low, my number is for the legislature to meet is $30,000 a day. That's what it's costing us. So you put in another 20-day session in the off year. Well, you can do the math. It's a lot of expense. It was put in to give serious consideration to the budget. Well, it got to be about anything except the budget. So in the 20-day session, to try to keep it to the budget, they said to introduce a bill has to have a 2/3 vote. Well, then we tried to limit the debate on those. Nonetheless, we spent days and days and days in the 20-day session voting on the 2/3 vote, whether to let them in or not. And then we could go and do all this other stuff. Well, one of the reasons we did that is because when the budget session started, the budget wasn't ready. So the Appropriations Committee would start with the budget at the same time. Maybe they'd start before, but it wouldn't be ready. And so it would be maybe 10 days into a 20-day session before the budget hit the floor. So now there's been some movement that way, and Speaker Horstman had a lot to do with that because he was a longtime member of the Appropriations Committee and really understands that process. So now I think the budget has to be, I don't know exactly what the rule is, but the budget has to be on the floor like within 2 or 3 days after the budget session begins. And we're still going to have these 2/3 votes, and we're going to have people trying to get all sorts of issues in that don't have anything to do with the budget. But there's been an effort over the years to get more attention focused on the budget and less on all this other stuff. The other problem, frankly, with the budget is it's hard to hold the legislature's attention for 20 days on the budget. It's boring, it's intricate, it's all kinds of just ugly stuff in there, and it's numbers, and some people frankly can't balance their own checkbook. How are they going to sit and study a budget with the state for 20 days and understand anything at the end? And so they get bored, and so they don't do a good job. So that's another problem that we fight. I think every legislature, I think even Congress fights that. There's an awful lot of people in Congress that don't have a clue about the budget. But I tell you, the budget is so darned important, and it's going to become even more important here because we're out of money. And now we find that we have some legislators who don't understand that we're broke, and they just don't get it. And they don't understand this thing the Wyoming Taxpayers Association has said for years and years and years. The number moves around a little bit, but it's sort of always been the same, and that is this ratio that a family of 4 in Wyoming pays in state taxes, not federal taxes, state taxes, sales tax and so forth, something in the order of $3,500 a year in taxes, and gets about $30,000 in benefits. And people don't understand that. And even a lot of legislators don't understand that. So they're walking around, it's kind of like a person that's dead and doesn't know it yet. And we're broken, we don't know it yet. And we're going to have, I don't know how it's going to come out. One of my great regrets is that we worked so hard in the legislature to save this money, save the rainy day fund. We got it to $1.5 billion, and everybody says, my God, $1.5 billion, we could never spend it. Well, remember, the biennial budget is about $3.2 billion. And we were trying, when Senator Nicholas was president of the Senate and I was Speaker of the House, we were trying for a number of years leading into that. We tried to build it up. We wanted to have a full biennium's worth of money in the savings account. That'd be $3.2 billion, not 1.5. Well, there's a history of that. Back in the 90s, in the late 90s, when we were broke, before coal bed methane came in and bailed us out, we did have a full biennium's worth of money saved. And we burned through every penny of it, every dime. We burned it all. And now we're only sitting here at a half of a biennium budget in savings. And so you just have to take the zeros off those numbers sometimes, I think, and really look at them. But we just don't have near as much money as some people think we have. Then there's another really interesting thing at play here. We have the rainy day fund at $1.5 billion. Well, if you did 4% on that, I think that must be 60 million a year in interest that it earns at 4%. I think I'm right on that. And so at some point it dawned on people, well, if we start spending the rainy day money, then we're eating our seed corn because we're not going to have those earnings anymore. So it all begins to cascade. And when it comes back, it just cascades backwards on you. And we'll see where it goes. But that's what the budget session is supposed to be about. The regular session is supposed to be about other things.
Will you talk briefly about, in that process of maybe legislation gets brought up in a regular session and doesn't pass, and then doesn't meet 2/3 vote, and so it has to come back around the third year, just kind of the longevity of passing a bill that maybe some go on the first go round and others may take years or a decade to sort of come to fruition. And if you have an example.
I do have an example. In fact, a couple of examples. In my law practice, I do a lot of real property work, transactional work, and things like that. You have an isolated piece of property somewhere that has no access to it. And that actually was addressed in 1890 when we became a state. And not long after that, the Supreme Court said it's the public policy of the state of Wyoming that nobody will be denied access to their land. And it was back in the old days when some poor pilgrim would go out somewhere and homestead 160 acres, and then the Swan Land and Cattle Company would sit there with it totally surrounded and say, well, you may own it, but you can't get to it. And our state just said, we're not going to do that way. And Colorado's got a similar provision. I know because I have a license there, and I think every state has a similar provision. So we had the what's called the private road law, and it was getting really outdated and getting a lot of problems with it. And so I set out to redo it. The other problem was the private roads were dealt with by county commissioners. And the statute said you're supposed to do it quick, but when you're working with county commissioners and they only meet every 30 days, and they got a lot to do besides that, and some of these things have 60-day notice periods in them, it just got to be untenable. So I set out to move the private road actions from the county commissioners to the district courts. It took me 8 years to get that done. And I ended up having to do it incrementally. I couldn't do it all at once. It was just too big a shot. So we started working. I had a great LSO attorney, which is another part of learning to be a legislator, is how to work with the attorneys and the researchers in LSO, not just the attorneys, but they have a lot of research capabilities in there too. And so we had a great attorney in there, Dave Groover, who kind of saw the point I was trying to make. And so we started passing bills and chipping away, and we finally got it moved. And we were having a hard time. The County Commissioners Association was basically opposed to the concept of moving these actions, taking them away from the county commissioners and giving them to the district judge. Well, finally, my fellow legal brethren did me a favor. They got so many of these were going on in the state, and county commissioners were spending all their time in these legal hearings with these dang lawyers arguing about roads and everything. And finally, enough of the county commissioners that threw their hands up in the air and they said, we just can't do this anymore. Well, and we were never elected to sit as a quasi judicial body. We're supposed to be in here trying to run the county. And so finally, the County Commissioners Association agreed. And that's when we were able to get the bill through that moved it from the county commissioners to the district court. And I think there's a lesson in there. And that is, if you're going to make a large change in some part of the law, you've got to get everybody in agreement. If the legislature sees that there's 6 advocacy groups and they've all got 6 different opinions and they're all going 6 ways, the legislature isn't going to do anything. They're going to say, go figure it out. But if those groups come in and they're agreed and there's not a lot of opposition, and the groups of affected governmental entities are all in agreement that something ought to be done, then the legislature is a lot more likely to move. So it took me 8 years to get all that done. Now, you mentioned a decade. Well, we had the revision of the drunk driving laws, the DUI laws, and that was truly a decade. It took Tony Ross a decade to get that done. And probably people don't remember much anymore, but I remember when you could drive down the road drinking a beer and there was no violation taking place. Now, if you went over 0.10, then you had a problem. But as long as you stayed under 0.10, you drive down the highway drinking a beer without a care in the world. And so that was a 10-year process. And he got to the 8-year point. Tony got to the 8-year point, and we had a bill. And all the kinks had been worked out over previous sessions. And he had a bill, and it passed. The Senate came over to the House. And there was one little kink left in it, which is somebody driving a motorhome with an open bottle of hard liquor somewhere in the motorhome. And there was a possibility they could reach back and grab the bottle and take a swig while they were driving. And so it went down. And our present Secretary of State, Ed Buchanan, is the one who cast the vote that shot it down. And it actually resulted in the closest thing I ever saw to a fist fight on the floor of the House when Tony came over. He was so angry. So he went back and fixed that. And that's when we got this thing in the motorhome. I think it's got to be out of the driver's reach, and it's got to be in a closed cabinet or something like that. We got that last little kink fixed, and then it passed. But it took Tony 10 years to get that done. And so do you want to have a term limit that says nobody can serve more than 2 terms? How are you ever going to get something like that done? And there's a lot of, I mean, it sounds trivial, but it's not. There's a lot of very deep thought, deep concern. And you have all these cross currents in the legislature, okay? You got the gender cross current. You've got the gay cross current. You've got the racial cross current. You've got and the ag cross current. You've just got no end of cross currents. And all of them have to be aligned sufficiently to let a bill go through and become law. And it's hard work, and it takes some people, some old heads with some experience that have been there a while, I think, in order to get some of those big projects done.
Those are great examples. Maybe in that same vein, I think something we've prided ourselves in Wyoming is that we know each other, we call each other friends and neighbors, even on tough issues. It doesn't have to be personal, but it feels like even in Wyoming, some of those tides are changing in political silos and views of right and left, and just even behaviors of what people are willing to do. What are your thoughts on, they're kind of jargony words, but the ability to have civil discourse or work across the aisle? What do you think Wyoming can do to either maintain or grow that in the legislature? Or do you think it's an area to be concerned about?
There are always going to be partisan differences, and the legislature has to be broad enough to accommodate those. I've got to talk that I haven't done it lately. Well, we haven't had a session lately, but I like to talk to the legislature just about why they're there. There's 60 people in the House, there's 30 in the Senate. Every one of them had to have the temerity to put themselves up to scrutiny. and do the work and pay the money and go knock on doors and take a beating. And there isn't one of us that hadn't gone to a door somewhere and got thrown off the porch. And excuse me, everybody's gone through that. So in the House, there's 60 people there, and every one of them earned the right to be there. They deserve to be there. They deserve to be heard. They're not all going to agree, and they're going to say some things that really grate on each other. And so in the past, we've been able to maintain a civil atmosphere, and we've been able to listen to each other's arguments. And I don't know, I was always kind of all over the place, but a couple of times I made the Democrats' argument. I made a better argument for them than I thought they were making for themselves when I thought they were right. And I'll tell you, in fact, I'll tell you briefly a story about that. Strangulation of a family member. That was a bill that came through, and it came from the Senate. It was sponsored by Senator Hastert, who's a Democrat. It came to the House. The Democrats got it on the floor. We get in this debate. They're all saying, well, aggravated assault is already a law, and that's sufficient. You don't need strangulation of a family member. Well, aggravated assault is difficult to prove. And so we get in this big floor debate, and I find myself with Craft. What is her first name? Anyway, from Bernadine Craft. And I used to tell those guys once in a while, I always said, don't try her. You know, she was a national debating champion. You're going to be sorry. And every once in a while, oh no, they got to try her. And she just cut them to ribbons. So Bernadine Craft and me, and I think one other person, were pushing this bill. Ed Buchanan was the speaker and Tom Lubnow was the majority floor leader. They were on the other side. We get this big raucous debate going. At one point, I think, what am I doing here? Except I think this is right. I think it's the right thing. It should be an offense. And so we have this debate. We have this debate that goes back and forth. Finally, Ed Buchanan, we used to call him Bucky. Ed Buchanan got up, and the essence of what he said in his presentation is just, he said, well, we're just going to give him another buzzword to use in the trial. And I got up and said, well, murder's a buzzword. That seems to be working pretty well. And so we get in these arguments back and forth, and it finally passed by one vote. And now you hear strangulation of a family member being charged all the time because it doesn't have all the irregularities that aggravated assault would have. Okay, so where I was going with that is that it used to be common to do that. And we used to argue on both sides, and there was a civility and an accommodation, or comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, that's a word that's used sometimes. And it seems to be fading away, and there seems to be less and less willingness to and I won't call it compromise, because I don't think it is compromise, but there's less and less tolerance. People are just more and more intolerant of each other. And so it shows up in the legislature in really some ugly ways. And that's where I go back and say, look, you guys, you can say all you want to, but that other legislator's got a right to be here. They won their election the same way you won yours. Their constituents happen to think differently than yours. They think differently than yours. Now let's attack the problem. And so that's one of the reasons you have a rule on the floor. You can't use a person's name, because you can't personalize it, because it's never about that. It's about the issue. And when I was speaker, that's one of the few times I would insert myself, is if it started to get off on personalities or personal attacks or something, I wouldn't stand for that it's got to stay on the issue. And I always use the example, because sometimes we get in these knots in the legislature, we can't figure it out. And after all, we are a problem solving body. That's what we do, is solve problems. And so have you ever thought that the rules weren't applied the way they are, and somebody in the legislature just felt totally intimidated? And you get in one of these deals in the legislature where it's a big cat fight, and they're lined up 5 deep at every podium to speak. And the problem is, the reason that's going on is we can't find a solution. And wouldn't it be a shame if that legislator, that one legislator that had been so intimidated by personal attacks and so forth, knew the answer? And I've actually seen this happen, that they knew the answer. And if they got up at the podium and just said it, everybody would say, okay, we're done. That's it. And if that person were so intimidated, they wouldn't get up and say it. How does that serve the state of Wyoming? And the answer is it doesn't. It's a travesty. It's the worst thing that could happen. And so we've got to have more tolerance. I think we're getting some legislators. It's interesting, you know, because I think legislators, the way they get elected is by running against the legislature. You just watch these campaigns and see what they're saying. They're running against the legislature. Then they get elected and they go down there, and somewhere in the process, I think, oh no, I am the legislature now. Oh, now I really have a problem. But they have to understand that it's on the issue, that it's a problem-solving body, that the task is to try to find a solution for those problems that accommodates as many people as it will. And I wouldn't call that a compromise. I would call that crafting a solution. And when you get people down there who are so locked in, who are so bound up by ideologically that they can't wiggle, then you got a problem. Here's one example. Chairman Madden, Representative Mike Madden from Buffalo, who writes great articles in the paper. They are really insightful if you read them. He was chairman of the Revenue Committee, and he told me, he said, I walked into the Revenue Committee, and a majority of the Revenue Committee is charged with finding ways to raise revenue. He said, I walk into the Revenue Committee and I start counting noses, and a majority of the members on my committee sitting in front of me have already signed a pledge that they won't raise taxes. He says, what am I supposed to do? And in the end, I think he got discouraged. I've never talked to him, and maybe there's some other reasons, but I think he got discouraged and didn't run again because he couldn't get anything done, because you got these people that are locked in. Well, tell me this, how can you, I mean, we've already talked about first-year legislators, first-term legislators, second-term legislators, but before they get down there, I even had a legislator one time I saw walking around on the floor of the House before the session started. He and his wife and I went over and talked to him, and he was looking up, looking around. He said, I've never been here before. Okay, I can accept that. Let me show you some things. Let me help you. But when they walk in and they've never been there before, but they've already got a hard position that they will not compromise on about this piece of legislation and that piece of legislation, the other piece of legislation. They've never read the budget. They don't understand the nuances. They don't understand what difficulties in the other part of the state are, and they've already locked themselves into a position. Then you've got a problem. And so I think it's up to the voters. I think it's going to stay this way until people start going to the committee meetings, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. The Republicans are the most prominent, of course. People have got to start going to those meetings and say, look, that's enough of that. We're not going to put up with this thing. And they've got to send legislators down there who say, I'm not going to commit to a position, at least until I've heard the arguments. At least I want to, and I always said that when I campaigned, I got a lot of Democrats to vote for me, I think. And I always told them, look, I sat in the courtroom for years listening to arguments and dissecting them and then getting up and responding to them. But I'll be darned if I'm going to go in and take a position when I haven't even heard the arguments. And every time you get, and I remember Senator Moniz, when he came in the legislature one term after me, and he sat next to me the rest of the time we were in the House. And I remember he told me the first day we get in this big cat fight about some debate of some kind. He told me afterwards, he said, I changed my mind 3 times during the debate. Well, that's fine. And that's a level of tolerance because it's on the issue and it's on the problem. But when you get people who are so ideologically locked up that they're going to do whatever the party tells them to do, and they're going to take these hard, unyielding positions, then we're going to continue to have the kind of problems that you're talking about.
You say like the voters have to get involved. And one of those big questions for me is just how do you can translate a voting record really easily and say, okay, yes, no, yes, 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 no. But how do you translate reputation and character and integrity back to a population that's not going to watch a meeting? And I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've said for a long time, and I think this goes right to what you're talking about. We have the greatest form of government in the world. The real issue is, do we have the intellectual capacity to operate it? And I fear, I'm really worried that we're straying further and further away from that. Just look at the disdain and the distrust of science. that exists in Congress and in the legislature right now. And ask yourself, and I put it in simple terms. I told a guy the other day, I said, when's the earliest, when did you learn to drive? Oh, he said, 1960 something. I said, do you remember in 1960 when you drove that car, how that rattled all the time? Rattle, rattle, rattle. You used to spend all your time chasing rattles. And there was these things where they'd leave pipe or wrenches inside the voids and the fenders and stuff like that. I said, do these cars rattle anymore? If you get a rattle now, it's so unusual, you go looking for it. And the reason is science. It's mostly plastics. And I remember they started putting plastics in cars, and I couldn't understand where it was going. It was cheap old stuff, and it broke, and it was junky and wasn't very durable and all that. But they were working on it, and they got the molding process, and they got the chemistry, and they got the materials that they needed. And now these cars have lots and lots of plastic in them. And it's one of the reasons they don't rattle anymore, because you can't bolt two pieces of metal together and go bouncing up and down a washboard road. It's going to start to rattle, but these plastics don't. And so that's just a simple example. And yet we have this disdain and distrust for science today that just drives me nuts. And so the question is, the voters are going to have to, they're going to have to raise their game a little bit, I think, in terms of what they know and the kind of people they want to send down there. They're going to get exactly what they asked for, and they need to judge these candidates carefully and make sure. And it's back to this tax thing. The average person in Wyoming just can't fathom that they're getting that much for nothing, that they pay so little tax for so much they're getting. And I don't know if we're going to be able to solve that problem until it just runs down to the bottom. And it was interesting. I was in a snowstorm here a while back, coming back from Cheyenne to Laramie on the Happy Jack Road. And I know they're cutting back the budget, but the road wasn't plowed. And I'm telling you, you talk about a rodeo, about 45 miles an hour was all you could do, because you've got ruts and you've got the little snow drifts and everything, and your vehicle's jumping around. Nobody's used to that. Are we going to have, is that going to have to happen all over the state before people finally say, we got to do something about this? I don't know, but there's just no perception that there's a need right now. There's lots of things the legislature doesn't have to do. They don't have to fund cities and towns. They don't have to fund the highway department. They don't have to do anything. But education is unique because it's in the Constitution. And so the legislature has some influence over that. But in the end, if push comes to shove, the Supreme Court's driving that bus. And so that's when we got all that litigation. And it took them 10 years before they finally kind of declared a truce between the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said the legislature had come along far enough that they could accept it. When my old partner wrote that decision, he's the one that coined the term basket of goods, which we still use today to talk about. And, you know, we've added some things, and now we've added computer science to the basket of goods. And so now they're down there talking about, well, maybe we need to take some things out of the basket of goods. Well, good luck with that, because it's got to be an adequate education. But there are some legislators down there who are kind of spoiling for a fight again over education, and they want to cut it. And it's interesting because in Campbell 4, it's just sort of a passing reference in that opinion. You could read that opinion and not pick up on it unless you were looking for it. There's a passing reference in there to the fact the legislature can't simply say, well, we can't give these kids an adequate education because we don't have the money, because the legislature has the purse strings and they have the ability to raise the money. And so saying that we don't have the money is just tantamount to saying, well, we don't want to generate the money. And I don't think the Supreme Court's going to stand for that. And so we are going to have an adequate educational system. It costs a lot of money. A lot of legislators resent that, the expenditures that go into education, I think, forgetting about the education they got themselves and where did they think the money came from. And then you get to school construction, and you look at all the old school buildings, which are kind of they're disappearing now. But there had to be a huge commitment back in the 20s and 30s to build school buildings. You see these school buildings all over the state, and they didn't have any cold bonus money. They didn't have anything of the sort. And they just, district by district, they passed a bond issue. It went on the property tax, they paid it off, and they built these schools. Well, now the schools are wearing out. We get in another one of these tax fights over assessed valuation and education funding. So the solution was, before my time, but I could see it happen. The solution was, we'll take all the education money into Cheyenne, and then we'll reallocate it on an equitable basis. And so we had a couple of problems. There were rich districts and poor districts. That was one problem. Another problem we had was some districts just wouldn't pass a bond issue for schools. They just wouldn't do it. So we take all the money into Cheyenne, we reallocate it. Then they get the bright idea, just not too long before I got in, we had this thing called co-lease bonus money. And that's bonus money that we get when we do new leases for the coal mines, and some of that money comes to the state. Well, we had all this co-lease bonus money, so we quit doing bond issues. We quit taxing anybody for the schools, and we've been funding schools. And so I asked my old partner when he wrote that decision, I said, Mike, I said, how much is it going to cost to build all these schools and these facilities that you guys are talking about? And he said, well, the Supreme Court's done some figuring. And he said, maybe $1 billion. Well, that was when we were dead broke. And we're talking about, where's $1 billion going to come from to do this? Well, then we got lucky, and along came coal bed methane and coal mining and all that. And we've actually, and I haven't tallied the number lately, but we're somewhere north of $2.5 billion that we spent on school finance, on construction. And you see these nice schools everywhere. You get Lander, Thermopolis, wherever you go, you see these nice schools. And then we build a couple that we're not even using, where we made a mistake. One's in Jeffrey City, and another one's, where's the other one they're going to close? There's another one somewhere that's just sitting there. But we did all that. Well, so Senator Rothfuss, who's a Democrat, I mean, he's a smart guy. He's really a thinker. So one day there were, I guess it was an article he wrote in the paper, and he said, the coal lease bonus money's run out. It's not there anymore. And so he said the taxpayers had about a 20-year staycation here from taxes, and now we're going to have to start paying for schools again. Well, everybody went nuts, crazy. What are you talking about? Pay for schools? We're not going to, no new taxes. We're not going to be taxed for that. Well, here we go. And so how bad are the schools going to have to get, and how is it going to be resolved? Is it going to be the Supreme Court saying you will raise taxes? So here's the thing: we fund school operations from the school foundation account, which is funded by federal mineral royalties. Well, now federal mineral royalties are starting to tail down. So what are we going to do? How are we going to make up that funding? Well, if you look at the Constitution and you look at what the Supreme Court said, to the extent that school foundation account falls short because there aren't enough federal mineral royalties anymore, that's got to take a bite out of the general fund. So here comes a chunk out of the general fund for education. Now we're really starting to have fun, aren't we? And so that's kind of the direction I see that going. And when school, when they can't reduce the level of education, which they shouldn't, because we need our young people. We're going to do anything in the state, we've got to have an education. If we're going to solve this problem about the voters and the level of understanding and sophistication that they have to have an education to do that. So we can't cut that. And so education starts taking a chunk out of the general fund and chewing into that. At some point, there's going to be a crisis. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but it is going to be really ugly when it comes. And it just sets up a whole area of conflict that's just going to kind of come together all at once. And it is really going to be ugly.
Well, and I've heard from a few people in the executive branch that, there's a point that you cut faster and farther than you can rebuild. It's not a bell curve of decline where you take a couple years of decline and then you come back up in a couple years. You may cut in 2 years what will take 2 decades to replenish or to figure out how to put back. And so that's that conversation of like, we've cut the fat, we've cut the muscle, we're cutting the bone. And but still you have people who are hard and fast on the no new taxes.
So another place that manifests itself is that we have a lot of federal funding that comes into the state. I asked Don Richards one time. Don Richards he's a financial analyst in the LSO, and I've always said Don Richards is the smartest guy in state government. He is just frightfully smart. And I asked him one time, I said, just run me a back of the envelope figure and tell me how many federal dollars from all sources do we get in the state of Wyoming per year? And he said it's about $1 billion a year we get from the feds. I don't think anybody has any concept of that. A lot of that federal money comes in, for instance, in healthcare, Medicaid, all these other, I can't even name all the programs, but all the healthcare programs, but they all require a match. And so now you get a double kicker. You see where I'm going? So you cut the state funding and then the federal match disappears because the state's not qualifying by putting its share of the money. And so small cuts become big cuts. And so it's got an exponential multiplier to it that's going to be really ugly.
Okay, well, I said I would only take half an hour and we're coming on an hour, but it's been so good. Maybe I'll have you close along those lines. How do we as Wyoming look at a future where we can hold on to conservative values, independent, lifestyle, and the things we love and appreciate about our state, not at the cost of, all public goods and services, or at the cost of a legislature that can't get anything done? What kind of advice, or, if we could pour a glass half full vision, what do you think that would look like?
That's a hard question. And I think this might be a partial solution. I had a person explain to me, and I thought I knew a lot about politics, but I really learned a lot in the legislature. And I had a person explain to me one time, and it came as kind of a shock. He said, people in Wyoming aren't really Republicans. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. He said they're libertarians. And he said they vote with the Republican Party because that's the closest to their philosophy. But really, Wyoming is populated by libertarians. Okay, so if we accept that, it's going to have to be really thoughtful about it. I think we all believe in limited government. It's libertarian philosophy. I think we all believe in government closest to the people. We always move it down as close to the people as we can get it. Like Al Simpson used to say. Al Simpson said, out of all the political offices he ever held, the toughest one he ever had was the Park County Planning and Zoning Commission. Well, that's close to the people right there. When you get to DC, they can't get at you quite so easily. So we're going to have to, and I think that's going to be a constant measuring stick that we have to apply over and over again. How much governmental intrusion do we want in our lives, and where is it appropriate and where is it not? But that requires thought. It just can't be done in sound bites, and it requires a lot of debate, and people are going to disagree, and those disagreements, if you really whittle them down, you see these arguments in the legislature, and the next time you're down there, Mandy, and one's going on, just sit up in the gallery and say, okay, what's going on here? And when they're lined up 3 or 4 at every podium waiting to speak, and they all got to make their point, it's all about trying to solve a problem, and they're usually really thorny problems with a lot of one-offs in them and things, and everybody's got to get it all in. But in the end, everybody's going to try to go toward a solution to the problem that is the least painful. And if we're going to be Wyoming citizens and follow our libertarian philosophy, there's a lot of things proposed in government that we're probably going to say we're not interested in that. We don't want our government intruding in our lives that way. And I think that's the way that we maintain our conservative principles, and at the same time address those issues like the fire department. Everybody in town is a socialist when it comes to the fire department, right? I mean, we all pay in, and those that can pay more, and those that have the need, that's where the fire truck goes and puts the fire out. It's pure socialism. There's no doubt about it. So what we have to do is we have to have enough education. We have to have enough critical thinking that we can sort those things out and say, okay, this belongs here and this doesn't, and we'll sort of build and maintain a Wyoming lifestyle as we go.
The Leading in Wyoming podcast is brought to you by the Wyoming Community Foundation and the Dragisevich Foundation. Thank you for your support.